A regular Friday night in Dallas, Texas. The city lights glowed against the dark sky, casting shadows over the upscale district where the elite gathered. Expensive cars lined the streets. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed back and forth. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed from behind heavy doors. And at the center of it all stood the Apex Club, one of the most exclusive, members-only bars in the entire state. This wasn't a place you just stumbled into. You didn't walk in off the street with a credit card and a smile. No, you needed an invitation, a connection, a name. The kind of name that opened doors before you even knocked. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with wealth and status. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of light. Leather booths, imported all the way from Italy, lined the walls. The bar itself, mahogany, hand-carved, worth more than most people's yearly salary. And behind it sat a whiskey collection that could make a grown man weep, bottles older than some of the guests. Rare, untouchable, legendary. This was a place where power wasn't just present, it was worn like a second skin. Everyone here had something to prove, or at least, something to protect, their reputation, their image, their place in the hierarchy. And then, the door opened. A man stepped inside. Faded Wrangler jeans that had seen better days, scuffed boots that looked like they'd walked 1,000 miles, a plain black t-shirt, no logo, no brand, nothing flashy, no designer jacket, no polished shoes, just simple, ordinary, out of place. He moved with a quiet confidence, his step steady and unhurried. His posture was relaxed, but there was something solid about him, something grounded, like a tree that had weathered every storm and remained standing. But to the bartender, he was invisible, just another guy who'd wandered into the wrong zip code, the kind of guy you politely, or not so politely, asked to leave. The bartender barely glanced up from polishing a glass. His name was Trevor, mid-30s, slicked back hair, cologne that cost more than the man's boots, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Trevor had worked at the Apex Club for 4 years. He knew the game. He knew how to spot the people who mattered. And this guy, in jeans and a t-shirt, definitely didn't matter. Sorry, buddy, Trevor said flatly, not even bothering to make eye contact. Private event tonight, members only. The man didn't respond, he just stood there. Calm still. His eyes swept across the room, taking it all in, but his expression never changed. Trevor finally looked up, irritation flickering across his face. Why is this guy still standing here? Did you hear me? Trevor's tone sharpened, loud enough for nearby guests to notice. This is a private club. You can't just walk in here. Still, the man said nothing. He simply looked at Trevor with steady, unbothered eyes. And somehow, that silence made everything worse. Because silence has weight. It forces the other person to fill the void, to talk more, to reveal themselves. Trevor felt his jaw tighten. But this man, he didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just stood there, watching, waiting. And in that moment, something hung in the air, something the entire room was about to feel. Because this wasn't just another guy. This was Chuck Norris. And he was about to teach everyone in that bar a lesson they would never forget. What happens next? Let's just say, the moment they realize who he is, pure gold. Stick around because this story is about to get really interesting. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked? Drop your story in the comments. Let's talk about it. The Apex Club wasn't just a bar. It was a statement. A declaration to the world that you had arrived. That you belonged to a circle most people would never even glimpse. Located in the heart of downtown Dallas, tucked away on a street where even the buildings seemed to whisper exclusivity. This place had a reputation that preceded it, and that reputation, it was everything. The moment you walked through those heavy mahogany doors, you knew you were somewhere different. The air itself felt expensive, rich, thick, intoxicating. Crystal chandeliers, each one worth more than a luxury sedan, hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. The light danced off polished surfaces, reflecting in the mirrors that lined the walls. Leather booths, imported directly from a family-owned tannery in Florence, Italy, stretched along the perimeter, deep burgundy, butter soft, the kind of leather that only got better with age. Each booth could seat 6 people comfortably, but they were usually reserved for 4. Because space, like everything else here, was a luxury. The bar itself was a masterpiece. Hand-carved mahogany, stained a deep, almost black shade of brown. It stretched nearly 40 feet across the room, dominating the space like a throne. Behind it, shelves rose to the ceiling, lined with bottles that most people had only read about in magazines. Whiskeys aged for 50 years, cognacs that cost more per ounce than gold, wines from vineyards that didn't even advertise because they didn't need to. If you had to ask the price, you couldn't afford it. That was the unspoken rule. And the people who came here, they never asked. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, investors who moved markets with a single phone call, local celebrities whose faces graced billboards across the city, politicians who shaped policy over cocktails and handshakes, athletes whose contracts had more zeros than most people would see in a lifetime. This was where power gathered, where deals were made, where alliances were formed and enemies were kept close. But more than anything, this was a place where image mattered. Because at the Apex Club, you weren't just a member, you were a brand, and your brand had to be flawless. The dress code was strict, brutally so, tailored suits, designer labels, polished Italian leather shoes, watches that cost as much as a down payment on a house, accessories that screamed sophistication without saying a word. For the women, evening gowns, cocktail dresses, heels that could double as weapons, jewelry that caught the light just right, makeup applied with the precision of a surgeon. Anything less than perfection. You didn't belong, and the staff knew it. They had been trained, no, conditioned, to recognize the markers of status. The cut of a jacket, the brand of a watch, the way someone carried themselves. Within 3 seconds, they could size you up and decide whether you were worth their time. It was a skill, a talent, an art form, and they took pride in it. Because working at the Apex Club wasn't just a job. It was a position, a title, a badge of honor that said, I serve the elite. The staff moved through the room like well-oiled machines, silent, efficient. Invisible until needed, they anticipated requests before they were spoken, refilled glasses before they emptied, cleared plates before anyone noticed they were there, and most importantly, they protected the atmosphere. Because the atmosphere was everything. This was a place where people came to escape, to forget about the chaos of the outside world, to pretend, even for a few hours, that they were untouchable, that they existed in a bubble where ordinary rules didn't apply, where ordinary people didn't exist. And that's exactly how the members liked it. They paid for exclusivity, for privacy, for the assurance that everyone around them was just like them, successful, polished, and important. Or at least, that's what they believed. The culture at the Apex Club was built on appearances, on maintaining the illusion that everyone here was somebody. Because being a nobody, that was the worst thing you could be. Worse than broke. Worse than irrelevant. Being a nobody meant you didn't matter. And at the Apex Club, everyone mattered. Or at least, everyone who was allowed through the door. The vetting process was ruthless. Applications were reviewed by a committee. Background checks were conducted. References were called. Financial statements were quietly examined. Because they didn't just want your money. They wanted your pedigree, your connections, your ability to enhance the brand of the club itself. If you didn't bring value, you didn't get in. Simple as that. And once you were in, you were expected to maintain the standard, to dress the part, to act the part, to be the part. Any deviation was noticed. Any slip was whispered about. Any failure to meet expectations was a mark against you. Because in a place like this, reputation was currency, and currency was power. Trevor, the bartender, understood this better than most. He had spent 4 years perfecting his ability to read people, to separate the wheat from the chaff, to identify within seconds who deserved his attention and who didn't. And tonight, standing behind that magnificent mahogany bar, he felt confident in his judgment. He could spot a member from across the room, the way they walked, the way they held their drink, the way they commanded space without even trying. And this man who had just walked in faded jeans and a plain t-shirt, with scuffed boots and no design or anything, he didn't fit, not even close. Trevor didn't need to check the membership list. He didn't need to ask questions. He already knew. This guy was in the wrong place, and it was Trevor's job to make that clear. Politely if possible, firmly if necessary, because at the Apex Club, standards weren't suggestions, they were laws. And Trevor was about to enforce them. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his judgment was about to cost him everything. Because the man standing in front of him wasn't some lost tourist. He wasn't some confused nobody who'd wandered in by mistake. He was Chuck Norris, and Chuck Norris didn't need to prove he belonged. He just did. His name was Trevor, and if you asked him, he'd tell you he was damn good at his job. mid-30s, with slicked-back hair that he spent 20 minutes perfecting every morning. Designer cologne, something Italian with notes of bergamot and leather. That cost him a week's worth of tips. A smile that he could turn on and off like a light switch. Bright and charming when he needed it to be. Cold and dismissive when the situation called for it. Trevor had worked at the Apex Club for 4 years. 4 years of serving the city's elite. 4 years of pouring whiskey that cost more than his rent. 4 years of perfecting the art of knowing who mattered. And he prided himself on that skill. He could spot a hedge fund manager from across the room, the way they checked their watch, expensive, understated, Swiss-made. The way they ordered, confident, no hesitation, always top shelf. He knew which drinks to pour before the words left their mouths. He understood the game, the unspoken rules, the invisible hierarchy that governed every interaction in this place. And part of that game, a crucial part, was keeping out the people who didn't belong. The wannabes, the social climbers, the lost souls who wandered in thinking this was just another bar. Trevor saw himself as a guardian, a protector of the club's sacred atmosphere. And tonight, standing behind that 40-foot mahogany bar, he felt that familiar tingle of duty. Because walking toward him right now, boots that had seen better days, scuffed, worn, the kind you'd wear to a construction site, not a members-only club, a plain black shirt with absolutely nothing remarkable about it. No logo, no brand, no statement, just plain. Trevor's radar went off immediately. Wrong clothes, wrong energy, wrong everything. He didn't even look up from the glass he was polishing. A crystal tumbler, spotless, catching the light from the chandelier above. He held it up, inspecting it with the kind of focus that said, "I'm busy with important things." The man approached the bar, stopped, stood there quietly. Trevor let the silence hang for a moment. A power move, make them wait, make them feel out of place. Then finally, without making eye contact, Trevor spoke. "Sorry, buddy," he said, his tone flat and dismissive. "Private event tonight, members only." The man didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there calm still, unbothered. Trevor felt a flicker of annoyance. Why is this guy still standing here? He finally glanced up, meeting the man's eyes for the first time, and what he saw made him even more irritated. No embarrassment, no confusion, no stammering apology about being in the wrong place. Just calm, pure, unshakable calm. Trevor set down the glass with a little more force than necessary. "Did you hear me?" His tone sharpened now, loud enough that a few guests at nearby tables glanced over. "This is a private club. You can't just walk in here." Still, the man said nothing. He simply looked at Trevor with those steady, unbothered eyes, and that silence, that infuriating, powerful silence, made everything worse. Because silence has a way of exposing people. It forces them to keep talking, to fill the void. Stealing glances, a businessman in a three-piece suit smirked into his bourbon. Trevor felt a surge of validation. "Yeah, they're watching. They see me doing my job, protecting this place." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look," he said, gesturing vaguely at the man's clothes. "I don't know who told you this was open to the public, but it's not. This is the Apex Club. The Apex Club. Do you understand what that means?" The man still didn't respond, didn't defend himself, didn't argue. He just stood there, hands resting lightly on the edge of the bar, grounded, present, unmoved, and somehow, that calm was more intimidating than any words could have been. Trevor felt his face flush. Is this guy mocking me? Unless you've got a membership card. Trevor continued, his voice rising. You need to turn around and leave. Right now. A few more guests were watching now, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. One woman leaned over to her companion and whispered something. They both chuckled. Trevor felt emboldened, encouraged. This is my moment. Put this guy in his place. He crossed his arms, standing a little taller. So do yourself a favor, he said, his voice now carrying across half the bar. Walk out now before I have to call security and make this embarrassing for both of us. The man finally moved, but not toward the door. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for one of the bar stools, pulled it out. The scrape of wood against marble echoed in the suddenly quiet room, and then he sat down, sat down, hands folded calmly on the bar, eyes forward, completely, utterly unbothered. Trevor's face went red. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me."
Are you serious right now?
Trevor's voice cracked slightly, anger bleeding through his professional veneer.
Are you deaf?
He slammed his hand on the bar. The sharp crack made a few people jump.
Get out. No.
But the man didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't move. He just sat there, calm as a still lake. And in that moment, something shifted in the room. Because a few of the sharper guests, the ones who'd been around long enough to recognize real power when they saw it, started to notice something. This wasn't a guy who was embarrassed. This wasn't a guy who was confused or lost. This was a guy who was choosing to stay silent, and that choice, that unshakable composure, that was the kind of thing you didn't see every day. One older gentleman, a man named Mr. Castellano, who'd spent 30 years in private security, squinted at the man in jeans. Something about him seemed familiar. The way he held himself, the quiet confidence, the absolute stillness. Mr. Castellano leaned over to the woman beside him. "Do you recognize that guy?" he whispered. She glanced over, frowning. "Should I?" "I don't know," Mr. Castellano murmured, his eyes never leaving the man at the bar. "But I feel like I should." Meanwhile, Trevor was spiraling. His hands were shaking now. His breathing was shallow, because nothing, in his 4 years at the Apex Club, had prepared him for someone who simply refused to react. He grabbed his phone.
"That's it," he snapped.
"I'm calling security." The man still didn't move, didn't protest, didn't argue. He just sat there, waiting, and that patience, that absolute, terrifying calm was about to change everything. Have you ever judged someone too quickly and regretted it later? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's hear your story. There's a difference between someone who can't defend themselves and someone who chooses not to. Most people never learn that difference. They confuse silence with weakness. They mistake patience for passivity. They assume that if someone isn't fighting back, it's because they don't know how. But that's not always true. Sometimes, often, the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous, not because they're planning violence, but because they've mastered something most people spend their entire lives struggling with: control, real control. Not the kind where you knuckle your emotions and barely hold it together, but the kind where your emotions don't control you in the first place. Chuck Norris had spent decades mastering this art. As a martial artist, he'd learned early on that physical strength meant nothing without mental discipline. You could have the fastest punch in the world, the strongest kick, the most devastating technique, but if you couldn't control your mind, your emotions, your reactions, you'd lose every single time. Because fighting isn't just about technique, it's about composure, about staying calm when everyone around you is losing their minds, about maintaining clarity when chaos erupts. And right now, sitting at that bar in his faded jeans and plain t-shirt, Chuck was a living example of that principle. Trevor was pacing behind the bar now, muttering under his breath, his face flushed red, his movements sharp and agitated. He kept glancing at Chuck, then away, then back again, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Why isn't this guy leaving? Why isn't he embarrassed? Why isn't he doing something? But Chuck wasn't doing anything, because he didn't need to. He just sat there, hands folded calmly on the polished mahogany surface. His posture relaxed but upright, his breathing steady and even. His eyes taking in the room, the guests, the staff, the atmosphere, with the kind of awareness that came from years of training. Because that's what most people didn't understand about martial arts. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about seeing, reading body language, sensing energy shifts, noticing the small details that revealed everything you needed to know about a situation. And right now, Chuck was reading the room like an open book. Trevor's insecurity masked his authority. The guests' curiosity mixed with judgment. The tension building like static electricity before a storm. He saw it all, and he remained perfectly still. Because silence, real silence, isn't passive. It's active. It's a choice, a strategy. When you stay silent, you force the other person to fill the void, to keep talking, to reveal themselves, to expose their insecurities, their fears, their true nature. And Trevor was exposing himself with every word, every gesture, every condescending remark. Chuck didn't need to say a single word. Trevor was doing all the work for him. A few guests were starting to notice this now, not consciously, perhaps. But on some instinctive level, they sensed something was off. Because when someone insults you and you react with anger, that's expected, normal, it confirms the power dynamic. But when someone insults you and you remain completely calm, that's unsettling. That flips the script. Suddenly, the person doing the insulting looks desperate, out of control, weak, and the person being insulted, they look powerful, grounded, untouchable. One woman in a designer dress leaned toward her husband. "Why isn't he leaving?" she whispered. Her husband shrugged, but his eyes never left Chuck. "I don't know. But something about this doesn't feel right." "What do you mean?" "I mean, look at him. He's not nervous, he's not uncomfortable, he's just calm. So people who are out of place aren't usually that calm." Across the room, Mr. Castellano was having the same realization. He'd worked with enough high-level operators in his career to recognize the signs. The stillness, the controlled breathing, the way Chuck's eyes moved, constantly aware, never anxious. That wasn't the body language of someone who'd wandered into the wrong place. That was the body language of someone who knew exactly where they were and had chosen to be there. Mr. Castellano set down his drink, his full attention now on the man at the bar. Who is this guy? Meanwhile, Trevor's phone was in his hand. His finger hovered over the screen. Security was on speed dial. One button and this whole situation would be over. This guy would be escorted out. The atmosphere would return to normal. Trevor would be validated. His job would be secure. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way Chuck sat there, so completely unbothered. Maybe it was the way a few guests were now watching with genuine curiosity instead of amusement. Maybe it was some small, quiet voice in the back of Trevor's mind whispering that he might be making a terrible mistake. He glanced around the room, looking for support, for backup, for someone to confirm that he was doing the right thing. But the guests who'd been smirking earlier weren't smirking anymore. They were watching, waiting, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Trevor's hand was shaking now, his breathing shallow, because for the first time tonight, he wasn't sure, and uncertainty was a feeling he hated. Chuck noticed the shift, the hesitation, the crack in Trevor's confidence, but he still said nothing, didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't do anything to make Trevor feel worse than he already did, because that wasn't the point. The point wasn't to humiliate Trevor. The point was simply to exist, to be present, to show without words that dignity doesn't come from status or clothes or validation from others. It comes from knowing who you are and not needing to prove it. Chuck had learned this lesson decades ago, in dojos and training halls, in competitions and real fights, in moments where everything was on the line and the only thing that mattered was staying centered. He'd learned that the strongest people aren't the ones who shout the loudest. They're the ones who can stay silent, even when they have every right to speak. And right now, in this overpriced bar full of people who'd never learned that lesson, Chuck was teaching it. Not with words, not with lectures, but with presence, with stillness, with the kind of quiet power that can't be faked or bought or earned through anything except years of discipline and self-mastery. Trevor looked at his phone, then at Chuck, then back at his phone. His finger trembled over the call button, and in that moment, the entire bar seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see if Trevor would make the call, waiting to see how this impossible, tension-filled standoff would resolve. But before Trevor could press the button, a voice cut through the silence. "Trevor." It was calm, controlled, authoritative. Trevor's head snapped up, and standing behind him, arms crossed, expression unreadable, was Michael, the floor manager, and the look on Michael's face said everything. Put the phone down. Michael had been watching from across the room. He'd seen the whole thing unfold, the man in jeans walking in, Trevor's dismissive attitude, the escalating tension, the growing audience, and unlike Trevor, Michael had learned a long time ago that appearances could be deceiving, dangerously deceiving. He'd worked in high-end hospitality for 15 years, started as a server in New York, worked his way up through hotel management, dealt with celebrities, politicians, billionaires, and everyone in between. And in those 15 years, he'd learned one critical lesson. The most important people often look the least important. Real wealth didn't need to announce itself. Real power didn't need validation. Real status was quiet, understated, confident enough not to care what anyone thought. And the man sitting at the bar right now, he had that energy. Michael had noticed it the moment he walked in. Not because of what he was wearing, but because of how he was wearing it. The complete lack of self-consciousness, the grounded, centered presence, the way he moved through space like he owned it, not arrogantly, but naturally. Like someone who'd earned the right to be comfortable in their own skin. That wasn't the body language of someone who'd wandered into the wrong place. That was the body language of someone who belonged. And now, watching Trevor spiral into a public confrontation, Michael knew he needed to intervene, fast. "Trevor," he said again, his voice cutting through the noise. Trevor spun around, relief flooding his face. "Michael, thank God," he said quickly, gesturing toward Chuck. "This guy refuses to leave. I've asked him 3 times, politely, and he just sits there like..." "I know," Michael interrupted, his tone measured. "I heard. So you'll handle it." Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked slowly toward the bar, his eyes never leaving the man in jeans. And the closer he got, the more certain he became. I know this guy, not personally maybe, but he'd seen that face before, on TV, in magazines, where Michael stopped a few feet away from Chuck, studying him carefully. The strong jawline, the calm, steady eyes, the quiet intensity that radiated from him like heat from a fire. And then it clicked. Not completely. Not with absolute certainty. But enough to make Michael's stomach drop. "Oh no. Oh God, please don't let this be what I think it is." He cleared his throat, keeping his voice professional. "Sir," he said, his tone completely different from Trevor's. Respectful, almost careful. "I apologize for any confusion. May I ask if you're a member here?" Chuck looked up at Michael, and for the first time since sitting down, a faint hint of something amusement, maybe, crossed his face. "I am," Chuck said simply. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Trevor's mouth fell open. "Wait, what?" he stammered. "No, there's no way. I would have recognized." Michael shot him a look that could have melted steel, a look that said, without words, "Shut up. Right now. Before you make this worse." Trevor's voice died in his throat. Michael turned back to Chuck, his professionalism snapping into full gear. "I see," he said carefully. "And may I ask your name, sir? Just so I can verify in our system." Chuck held his gaze for a long moment. The entire bar seemed to lean in. Guests who'd been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Even the music seemed quieter somehow. Everyone was waiting for the answer, waiting to see if this quiet man in faded jeans was about to prove Trevor spectacularly wrong. Chuck took a slow breath, not nervous, not dramatic, just steady. And then, in that same calm, unhurried voice, he said, "Norris." Silence. Complete, absolute silence. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. And then crash. Someone dropped their glass. The sound of shattering crystal against marble echoed through the room like a gunshot. Mr. Castellano sat back in his chair, eyes wide, hand covering his mouth. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew I recognized him." The woman beside him gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Wait, the Chuck Norris." "The Chuck Norris," Mr. Castellano confirmed, shaking his head in disbelief. Across the room, the businessman in the 3-piece suit, the one who'd been smirking earlier, had gone pale. His bourbon sat forgotten in front of him. His eyes locked on Chuck like he was seeing a ghost. "Oh my God," someone else whispered. "That's Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris. Are you serious right now?" The whispers spread like wildfire, guest to guest, table to table. Within seconds, the entire bar knew. And Trevor looked like he was about to pass out. His face had gone from red to white in an instant. His hands were shaking, his breathing rapid and shallow, because the reality of what he'd just done was crashing down on him with the force of a freight train. He hadn't just insulted a random guy. He'd insulted Chuck Norris, martial arts legend, Hollywood icon, a man whose name was synonymous with toughness, discipline, and respect, a man who had an entire internet culture built around his mythical abilities. And Trevor had told him to leave, had called him buddy, had insulted his clothes, had publicly humiliated him in front of dozens of witnesses. Trevor's legs felt weak, his vision blurred. "I'm fired. I'm so fired. I'm beyond fired." Michael, meanwhile, had closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for strength. When he opened them again, his expression was pure professionalism, but his voice carried a weight it hadn't before. "Mr. Norris," he said, and there was genuine respect in those words now. "I cannot apologize enough for the way you were treated tonight. This was completely, utterly unacceptable." Chuck looked at him, and instead of anger, instead of the righteous fury that would have been completely justified, there was just calm. That same, unshakable calm. "It's all right," Chuck said quietly. "These things happen." Michael blinked. "It's all right. ITSALIGHT. Most people in Chuck's position would be demanding to see the owner, threatening lawsuits, making sure everyone responsible got fired on the spot. But Chuck Norris, he just said it was all right, like this was no big deal, like being publicly disrespected in front of dozens of people was just. Tuesday. Michael didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. Because a man who could remain that calm after being treated that badly, that was either the most forgiving person in the world, or the most dangerous, and Michael had a feeling it might be both. He straightened up, professional mask firmly in place. Would you like me to bring the owner over, Mr. Norris? I'm absolutely certain he'd want to apologize personally. Chuck considered this. The whole room waited, dozens of eyes, dozens of held breaths, and then Chuck shook his head. Not necessary, he said simply. Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. Are you certain? I'm certain. Is there anything at all, we can do to make this right? Chuck glanced around the room, at the frozen guests, at the horrified staff, at Trevor, who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. And then Chuck smiled. Just a little, just enough. You could get me a drink, he said. News travels fast in exclusive circles, but in a place like the Apex Club, it travels at the speed of light. Within 60 seconds of Chuck revealing his name, every single staff member knew. The servers whispered frantically to each other near the kitchen doors. The hostess at the front desk covered her mouth in shock. The valets outside were already pulling out their phones, texting friends. Even the chef, who rarely left his kitchen for anything, poked his head out to catch a glimpse, because this wasn't just any celebrity sighting, this was Chuck Norris. The man, the myth, the legend, the person whose name had become synonymous with unstoppable force and unshakable character. The man who'd inspired countless jokes precisely because his real-life reputation was so impossibly impressive that humor was the only way to process it. And Trevor, had just tried to throw him out. In the back office, away from the stunned guests and watchful eyes, Trevor was having a complete meltdown. He paced back and forth in the small room like a caged animal. His hands ran through his carefully slicked hair, ruining the style he'd spent 20 minutes perfecting. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. His breathing came in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know. He kept repeating, his voice cracking. How was I supposed to know? He was wearing jeans, just regular jeans, and boots, and a plain shirt. How was I supposed to know? Michael sat behind the desk, fingers steepled, watching Trevor spiral. His expression was unreadable, a mix of disappointment, frustration, and something else. Maybe pity. You weren't supposed to know. Trevor, Michael said quietly, his voice cutting through Trevor's panic. That's the point. Trevor stopped pacing, turning to face him. What? You weren't supposed to know who he was? Michael repeated, leaning forward. You were supposed to treat him with respect regardless of who he was. The words hit Trevor like a physical blow. His mouth opened, then closed. Because somewhere, deep down, he knew Michael was right. Do you understand what just happened out there? Michael continued, his voice calm but firm. Trevor shook his head weakly. You didn't just insult a customer, Trevor. You revealed something about yourself. About how you see people. About what you think matters. I was just trying to protect the club's standards. But judging someone based on their clothes, Michael interrupted. By assuming that someone in jeans couldn't possibly belong here? Trevor's face flushed red. That's exactly what you did, Michael said. You saw his outfit and decided he wasn't worth your respect. You didn't ask questions, didn't verify, didn't even give him the benefit of the doubt. You just decided. The silence in the office was suffocating. Trevor slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. Am I fired? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael sighed.
I don't know yet. That's not my call.
Whose call is it? Michael stood up, straightening his jacket. The owner's. And possibly Mr. Norris's. Trevor's head snapped up, panic flooding his eyes. Chuck Norris gets to decide if I keep my job. He's the one who was wronged, Michael said simply. It's only fair he has a say in how we handle it. Trevor's face went pale. Oh God, I'm done. I'm completely done. Michael walked toward the door, then paused, looking back. Maybe, he said. Or maybe this is your chance to learn something. Learn what? Trevor asked desperately. That respect isn't about what someone's wearing. It's about recognizing their humanity, their dignity, their right to be treated well regardless of how they look. Michael opened the door. Stay here. I'll let you know what happens. And with that, he left Trevor alone with his thoughts, his regrets, his crushing realization of how badly he'd messed up. Back in the main room, the atmosphere had completely shifted. Where there had been judgment and smirking, there was now respect and curiosity. Guests who'd been laughing at Trevor's treatment of Chuck now looked embarrassed. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others watched Chuck with something close to awe, because they'd all witnessed something extraordinary. They'd seen someone publicly disrespected remain completely, utterly calm, no anger, no retaliation, no ego, just grace. And that grace was more powerful than any outburst could have been. Michael had personally poured Chuck a glass of bourbon, a 50-year-old bottle that wasn't even on the menu, the kind reserved for only the most valued members. Chuck had accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you," and taken a small sip. He sat there now at the bar, as if nothing unusual had happened. As if this were just another Friday night. As if being insulted and then vindicated was all part of the routine. Mr. Castellano finally worked up the courage to approach. He walked over slowly, respectfully, the way you'd approach someone you genuinely admired. "Mr. Norris," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Frank Castellano. I just wanted to say it's an honor, sir. A real honor." Chuck shook his hand firmly but gently. "Appreciate it, Frank. I have to ask," Mr. Castellano continued, unable to help himself. "How do you stay so calm? I mean, what just happened? Most people would have lost it." Chuck considered the question, taking another small sip of his bourbon. "Getting angry doesn't change anything," he said simply. "Just makes noise." Mr. Castellano shook his head in amazement. That's incredible. I don't know if I could do that." Chuck smiled slightly. "Sure you could. Just takes practice." "Practice? Yeah. Controlling your emotions is like any other skill. You work at it, train it. Eventually it becomes natural." Mr. Castellano stood there, absorbing those words like they were gospel. Around them, other guests listened in, hanging on every syllable. Because this was Chuck Norris. Not Chuck Norris, the internet meme. Not Chuck Norris, the action star. But Chuck Norris, the person. The man who'd actually lived the principles people joked about. Who'd actually mastered discipline, control, and respect. And seeing it in person, witnessing that calm, that grace, that quiet strength, was something none of them would ever forget. A young woman at a nearby table leaned over to her friend. "I can't believe Trevor almost kicked out Chuck Norris," she whispered. Her friend shook her head. "I can't believe Chuck Norris is being this nice about it. I would have gotten that guy fired immediately. Right? That's what makes it even more impressive." And she was right. Because Chuck could have destroyed Trevor's career with a single phone call. Could have made an example of him. Could have demanded immediate consequences. But he didn't, and that restraint, that choice to show mercy instead of power, was more impressive than any martial arts move or action movie scene. It was real strength, the kind you can't fake, the kind that comes from decades of discipline and character. Michael returned from the back office, approaching Chuck carefully. "Mr. Norris," he said quietly. "The owner is on his way. He'll be here in about 10 minutes. Chuck nodded. "All right. And Trevor?" Michael hesitated. He's extremely sorry. And terrified." Chuck took another sip of bourbon. "I imagine he is. What would you like us to do?" Chuck looked at Michael evenly. And what he said next would change everything. "What do you think Chuck should do? Should Trevor be fired? Or does everyone deserve a second chance? Drop your opinion in the comments. We want to hear what you would do." Chuck set down his glass slowly. The amber liquid caught the light from the chandelier above, creating small patterns on the mahogany bar. He looked at Michael. Really looked at him with those calm, measured eyes. "What do I think you should do?" Chuck repeated the question back. Michael nodded, waiting. The guests who were close enough to hear had gone silent. Everyone wanted to know. What would Chuck Norris say? Would he demand justice? Would he call for Trevor's termination? Would he make an example of him to send a message about respect? Chuck leaned back slightly on his bar stool, his posture still relaxed. "I think," he said slowly, "that everyone makes mistakes." Michael blinked. That wasn't the answer he'd expected. "Trevor judged me based on my appearance," Chuck continued. "That was wrong. But is it worth destroying his career over? He disrespected you, sir. Publicly. He did," Chuck agreed. "But he didn't do it out of malice. He did it out of ignorance." Michael processed this, his professional mask slipping slightly. "So you're saying?" "I'm saying that firing him doesn't teach him anything," Chuck said. "It just makes him bitter. Makes him a victim. He'll walk away thinking he got screwed over instead of understanding why what he did was wrong." The nearby guests exchanged glances. This wasn't just mercy. This was wisdom. But if you give him a chance to learn from this, Chuck continued, if you let him face the consequences of his actions while still keeping his dignity, that's when real change happens. Michael stood a little straighter. You want us to give him another chance? I want you to decide what's right for your club, Chuck corrected. But if you're asking my opinion, yeah, give him a chance, let him prove he learned something. Michael nodded slowly, respect evident in his eyes. That's very generous of you, Mr. Norris. Chuck shrugged. I've been underestimated before. I'll be underestimated again. That's life. But I don't need to ruin someone's life to prove a point. He picked up his glass again. Besides, he added with the faintest hint of a smile, I have a feeling Trevor's going to remember this night for the rest of his life. That's punishment enough, and he was absolutely right. 10 minutes later, Gregory Hale, the owner of the Apex Club, arrived. He burst through the doors looking like a man who'd just received the worst news of his life. His normally perfect hair was slightly disheveled. His tie was loose. His face was flushed from rushing over. He spotted Chuck immediately and made a beeline for the bar. Mr. Norris, he said, slightly out of breath. I am so incredibly sorry. What happened tonight is inexcusable, completely inexcusable. Chuck turned to face him, his expression neutral. Mr. Hale. Gregory stopped, surprised. You know who I am? Your club. Your reputation. Not hard to put together. Gregory looked like he might have a heart attack. Sir, I want you to know that we take this situation extremely seriously. The way you were treated goes against everything this club stands for. Does it? Chuck interrupted gently. Gregory froze. I'm sorry? Does it go against everything your club stands for? Chuck repeated. Or does it reveal exactly what your club stands for? The question hung in the air like smoke. Gregory's mouth opened, then closed. Around them, guests pretended not to listen while hanging on every word. Your employee judged me based on my clothes, Chuck said calmly. He assumed I didn't belong here because I wasn't dressed like everyone else. That's not a training failure, Mr. Hale. That's a culture problem. Gregory's face went pale. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Chuck replied. Just think about it. What message are you sending to your staff when you build a culture entirely around appearance and status? Gregory stood there speechless. Because Chuck was right, the Apex Club had built its reputation on exclusivity, on keeping out the wrong kind of people, on creating an environment where status and appearance mattered more than character. And tonight, that culture had backfired spectacularly. You want to know what I think? Chuck continued, his voice still calm but carrying weight. I think your bartender was doing exactly what he thought you hired him to do, protect the club's image. Keep out people who didn't look like they belonged. Gregory opened his mouth to protest, but Chuck raised a hand. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's what happens when you prioritize appearance over humanity. When you teach people that status matters more than respect. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread through the entire room. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Because they were part of this culture too. They'd laughed when Trevor insulted Chuck. They'd smirked and whispered. They'd enjoyed watching someone get put in their place, and now they were being forced to confront their own complicity. Chuck picked up his bourbon, swirling it gently. So here's my suggestion, he said. Don't fire Trevor. Teach him. Teach all your staff. Remind them that every person who walks through that door deserves respect. Not because of what they're wearing or who they know, but because they're human. Gregory nodded slowly, his throat tight. You're absolutely right, Mr. Norris. And I promise you, I give you my word, things are going to change. Good, Chuck said simply. Gregory hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Why are you being so understanding about this? Most people in your position would demand consequences. Would want someone held accountable. Chuck met his eyes. Because revenge doesn't build anything. It just tears things down. And I'd rather see people grow than watch them fall. The simplicity of the statement made it even more powerful. Gregory extended his hand. You're a better man than most, sir. Chuck shook it firmly. I just try to treat people the way I want to be treated. Everything else follows from that. A few minutes later, Gregory requested that Chuck speak to the staff, not to lecture them, not to shame them, but to share what he'd learned. Chuck agreed. So there, in the private back room of the Apex Club, the entire team gathered. Bartenders, servers, managers, kitchen staff, Even the valets came inside, and standing in front of them, still in his jeans and plain t-shirt, was Chuck Norris. The room was packed, silent. Everyone waited. Chuck looked around, making eye contact with several people. He saw their nervousness, their guilt, their curiosity, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and genuine. "I'm not here to make anyone feel bad," he began. "What happened tonight happened. We can't change it, but we can learn from it." People leaned in. "Respect," Chuck continued, "isn't something you demand from others. It's something you give freely to everyone, regardless of who they are or how they look." He paused, letting that sink in. "Tonight I was judged based on my clothes. And honestly, that happens to me more often than you'd think. It happens to everyone. But here's what I've learned over the years." He took a breath. "When you judge someone based on their appearance, you're not protecting standards. You're revealing your own insecurities, your own fears, your own need to feel superior." Trevor, standing in the back, felt tears prick his eyes. "Real confidence doesn't need to put others down," Chuck said. "Real strength doesn't need to prove itself. And real respect, it's given freely, not because someone earns it with their clothes or status, but because every human being deserves basic dignity." The room was absolutely still. "I've spent my life training in martial arts," Chuck continued. "And one of the first lessons you learn is this: the strongest person in the room is usually the quietest, because they have nothing to prove." He smiled slightly. "So if there's one thing I hope you take from tonight, it's this: treat everyone with kindness, not because of who they might be, but because of who you choose to be." Silence. And then, slowly, someone started clapping, then another person, then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in genuine, heartfelt applause, not polite, not obligatory, but real. Because Chuck Norris had just given them something more valuable than any tip or paycheck. He'd given them a lesson in character,